enjoy and listen to Gerry.
You say enjoy and Irini is looking at me in a weird way. Okay, hello. Are we lowering the lights or this or what? Yeah? No, it doesn't matter. Okay. Oh, we are. Okay. Okay, cool. Okay, good. I'm going to do this quickly because it's after lunch and otherwise you'll fall asleep. And also because if I go over time, Fiona will kill me. Okay. I'm not interested at all in design as art. It's a word, it's a thing. There's a lot to be said about this. I'm only interested in this case as typeface design as part of a social enterprise. That's the area where I think there are interesting observations to make that can be communicated and researched. A lot of the stuff I talk about has to do with observing social developments. This stuff is all out there. Ooh, okay. Literacy is changing. A lot of changes also in the profile of where people live, how do they communicate, who reads more. There's a huge transition in literacy levels, especially in people below a certain age. The stuff that Mo is talking about is really important. People also live differently. About 5 years ago, we passed the 50% point of everybody living in a city. That's a huge thing in a society. If you look at how sociologists look at social dynamics, when you have more than 50% of everybody in a community living in a city, things happen. You have increases in trade, you have social mobility going up, you have all sorts of issues like that that matter. And interestingly for us, from the point of view also of having awareness of a more diverse world, there's much more trade between parts of the world that didn't used to trade before. So this means that in the 60s, for example, mostly rich countries send stuff to other rich countries. Stuff on the West, on the far side of the slide means that actually there's much more diversity in the profile of trade globally. So big countries exchanging goods and trades and services with small countries, rich countries and poor countries as well. So all of that stuff is important, and also people moving between different locations. Migration is going up and so on. Now, all of that stuff introduces changes. We've had some hints of this from the historical point of view. Stuff that Elena was talking about had to do with dynamics between different communities and perceptions about communities. Mo was looking at things that are happening right now, and again, different profiles of communities and how they interact with texts. My thesis is that we are much less interesting individually or unique individually than we think. We like to think we are, but we're not. But when the contexts are similar, then the patterns of development and the trends that we follow are actually pretty consistent. If you start looking not at individual things, but at sets of stuff, look at how genres of documents develop over time and how kinds of documents and texts get transmitted across different kinds of genres and how these modify through time, then you start to begin to see patterns that transcend communities, languages, and so on. If you start looking at contexts, look at things around an environment, the business environment, the supply chain that feeds a certain system, all the systems that help make anything and distribute it and make it reach its audience and so on. All of that stuff matters. The object and its making might carry a different language, but it might still be the same kind of materials if it's printed, or the same kind of services and channels if it's a digital object. For each thing that you look at in detail, then start looking at what I would call, let's go back, the assembly systems. So anything that is a web page, it might be a system of layers of abstraction that assemble this thing, regardless of the language. The system might have been developed quite separately from any specific community, and that these communities have to import this and apply it to their own environments. It might have a set of resources that might have their own motivations and systems that develop them. Or it might have a language through which things are expressed. So CSS is a potentially culture agnostic language, but it has its own ideas about how things should be described and how people who get trained to use that language describe documents. So you cannot really talk about a document on its own. You have to look at it in relation to the assembly systems that put it together, a system of production, a language that describes objects or sequences of things, and so on. Once you start looking at these things, then you realize where the similarities are between objects. So if I'm looking at something like this is a very simple typographic arrangement. There's a lot of decisions about sequence, about hierarchy, about arrangement in 2 dimensions, about connections across different elements, about the use of space, about primary and secondary sources of information in reading, about connections between sources and reference and so on. All of these things have been derived from the limitations of an assembly system. So if you start looking at a system of making an object that is going to be printed in a specific technology and assembled and bound and so on, then you are looking at something that is taking a form that is a response to these limitations. That, in a weird way, is my phone, Mo. It's in the top pocket. It's a very strange thing that did not. Okay, in the small. I'll ignore it. Okay. Okay, so the other thing, agency. Who makes decisions? A lot of the stuff that we are talking about has to do with guys like this, sort of gray old men, occupying some position of authority in a northwestern environment, operating out of a specific knowledge system. That means an education environment, a set of resources that they have access to. In this case, especially these generations, people who don't look at original stuff very much other than what is readily available in their space of work. British Library or British Museum at the time. This might not be the same narrative as someone who is located in a very different part of the world, in this case Sumantri Samaravikrama in Sri Lanka, who has a different set of resources at her disposal, a different perspective and a different set of agency about how design happens. So I'm rushing through quite a lot of stuff because I want to say that a lot of these conditions help us make decisions about the role of typography in our communities. And the key factors have to do with how we have a balance, how we make a decision that is on certain continuums between modernity and traditionalism, between originality and innovation, authorship and ownership, and terminology and specification. So the stuff that Mo is talking about has to do with this dynamic between certain communities adopting certain forms as closer to their styles, their behaviors, representative more closely the kind of text that they think reflect their identities. The space for originality and innovation, how people then express themselves within a community as new, as individuals, as designers who are producing work worth being paid for, occupy a position within exactly that environment. So once you've got that first thing, can you figure that? No? Okay. Clue for people who don't have children, this is my son who's probably calling me, asking me for money. Okay, so parents in the room will not sagely know exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah. So going back to this, so you have this cascade of things that actually get decided. Authorship and ownership, agency, authority. These things matter quite a lot because once you create a set of specification, that belongs to a certain channel of distribution. It belongs to a set of relationships that have licenses, that have distribution channels, have limitations of their own, and so on. And it has the small pocket on the top. Yeah? This, no, he's a teenager. I can ignore my son if he's a teenager. If he's a young boy, I wouldn't. But if he's a teenager, I can ignore him. Yeah.
So you're going to turn on the straight to voicemail later?
Yeah. Okay, so that's actually quite important. You make anything, it's part of a network of relationship, of ownership, of people who are controlling risk, of people who are seeking to extract some value from this, and so on. And all of this happens in some environment where some kind of language is being used. I mentioned CSS earlier, but if you've been trained as a graphic designer, you have learned how to use certain tools. The tools have menus, they have ways of thinking about stuff. The fact that you're using InDesign, for example, that might think of things as objects that get placed on a canvas is a visual language of its own, and you have to connect to this. So this is a framework that helps you see typefaces and how we support communities as part of a much wider network. And this connects very much to the idea of fonts as infrastructure. This is something that we've been developing as a series of ideas with Pathume Godavata, who is also in Sri Lanka, over a number of years. the idea that fonts are not a thing in themselves, they're not a piece of design actually, that they're essential aspect of how communities enable their activity. It connects to services, to economic activity, it enables growth, but also things like social inclusion, identity, community, and belonging. Here's a couple of examples very recently, this is 2 months ago. A PhD published in a language for which no academic work had been published before in Peru. That is quite important because it shows that that language is not only a part of a tradition that is supposed to be maintained, but that is something that can generate the kind of terminology that you can use in academic discourse. Something again relatively recently, we're having a lot of discussion about, scripts of India. Well, scripts of India means what? Because there might be variations to the scripts that you might see if you look at a specification by a major publisher. And there might be smaller communities that use variations of the scripts or derivations and so on, which might not be part of a big national campaign to support something, and certainly might not be part of a policy by a major, let's say, Western software company to support. So what is part of NATO, which at the moment is a juggernaut of supporting or not supporting certain communities, is actually quite a political matter. So what does it mean to support anything? Support a script, support a language? That is one of the most difficult questions. Not so much if you're used to a one-to-one relationship between things and you come from a let's say, West Coast American perspective. And I say this quite consciously because if you're operating in that environment, then you might be thinking in quite simple forms of the language and the connection of the language and the resources that they support. So a one-to-one relation between a character and a glyph and how you build these in relation to a language. In reality, you've got something like this. What is Polish? What's the right dictionary for Polish? What if I'm looking at an earlier version of Polish from the 50s, the 60s, from last century? When do the spelling reforms take place? What about communities that are from different parts of a large country and they include local variations in expressions and so on? Which version of autocorrect does my phone use? Who decides which is the canonical version of any language that is embedded in my device? I did not get a dial when I was setting up my phone that said, what kind of Greek do you speak? Are you from the islands? Are you from the mainland? Are you educated then? What kind of spelling, say, rules do you choose to follow? Because maybe the kind of Greek I got educated in is different from the one that people are being taught now. And this happens in many languages. So that is a real problem. The assembly system, the things that brings together, again, is something that our technology tends to assume has a fairly narrow definition of what is a language, what are the scripts that encode it, and how these are put together. So what if I have an English text that talks about the history of the development of the Polish language? And within a paragraph, I might have words that change their spelling and their structure across time, and I have an automatic spell checker. Now, you might say, well, I am the editor, I can correct it. What if this is something that gets posted online? What if I'm using this in an educational environment and the system starts to intervene and have a very strong idea of what is the right form of the language? So this flattening of language, of scripts, to fairly simple forms that are easier to implement technically is something that we need to be aware of, because increasingly as we're working digitally, these things happen behind the scenes. So earlier I showed this slide where I had these levels of abstraction between, say, CSS and what I see in a browser. The moment I move to something that happens in a digital environment, I always work in a multiplicity of levels of abstraction. None of us here, I suspect, can actually read assembly language, which is what the computer is doing. Even programmers are working at levels of abstraction. So at which point do these decisions come in, and what are the assumptions that they're making, and what's the balance between this is a sufficient capturing of the language that we want to encode right now because we need to get the product out or not. Unless we are aware of these decisions, then we are actually probably committing quite serious errors of omission. Something that we keep coming back to again and again. What's the character set for a language? In most cases, we don't know. that doesn't have a single answer. I cannot say what's the character set for Greek or for Polish or for Devanagari. I need to know which version of Greek or Polish or Devanagari by when, and what are the rules for combination depending on the version of the text that you want to encode. Then if I'm looking at any examples, I need to ask, what's the agency behind them? Were there any assumptions made at the time that these things were composed, or limitations like the ones that a certain assembly system imposes that are now reflected in the form of the language that I see? Do I choose to accept those as a given and I take forward, or do I walk back away from them? So we're trying to figure out ways of explaining to people who come from a different environment, how do you do support? So no digital support. Nothing. You just have a typewriter and just some poor guy who had to write by hand the Greek, and because the English typewriter doesn't allow him to do it. This is not as bad as it seems, because actually when you're writing with a pencil, you can write anything you want. And then it's the problem of the typesetter, who might be a specialist with actually different tools, to say, okay, this is what needs to go there. This is much more prevalent than we think. This is lithographically produced. Script that is not encoded in a system of assembly. It looks like it's Chinese characters, but it's not. It's a music notation. There are other projects right now that are exploring things that look like existing scripts, but are relative minority uses. Nushu, I think, just went in a Unicode proposal for a script used by women only for correspondence in a specific region in China. Now that's an interesting case where you can see, I can understand exactly why this script was not at the top of the list of the technologists encoding them, because it's a small part of China, it's a community that might not have a market associated with it, or eventually it's a historical script and so on. But it's there, there's texts, there's people that need to understand this thing, I need some system of encoding it. So the simplest form is thankfully almost obsolete now in many cases, where people just hack any kind of digital system, just place something that looked like a set of outlines in a font that was built for something entirely different. I think this happened in Polish for all the accented characters, right? It used to happen. For more intents purposes, this is mostly dead right now. We've moved to an environment where usually there's some sort of reliable system of encoding that allows us to exchange things. And things that look a certain way will be attached to a name that makes sense, and a system of enumeration that will connect them to other instances of this. But it usually allows you to do something like this, just a simple form of monotone language that sounds like this and looks like this, and if the typography is like this, it will just be plain text. That's not much. And it's still broken. So you can go online, you can find a lot of examples where Sinhala doesn't work. And it's a whole country. It's millions of people there, and they cannot actually type on Facebook. Now, two things happen. You can see on the right that they start Latinizing the thing. That for me is always very interesting, because if I went as an outsider and told the community, from now on you will write your language in Latin characters, I would be driven out of the country as a colonial influence or whatever. However, people do it themselves, and they do it in Arabic, they do it in Hebrew, they do it in everything, and Greek. The really weird thing is that the translation works. So there's no glyphs in the font that Facebook is using, but actually the underlying system, one level of abstraction down, can understand the content and can translate something for you. So it's quite but it's really odd that in 2019 there are even mainstream languages that are not properly covered. The implied assumption is that there's a system that is connected to a one-to-one representation of the script. This is Granta, a relatively recent project where a researcher had to come up with a keyboard because they didn't have a way of entering the thing. It doesn't matter that the script is relatively extinct. It is extinct as an active script, but there is a community that's using it. What matters is that there is a keyboard that needs to have a one-to-one relation between an action of the user and a form of the character, or to explain what happens to get other forms, or to have an algorithm that will create combinations of characters according to certain rules. Somebody has to figure out what these rules are. Somebody has to make a decision about these relationships, which might be many-to-one relationships, and lock them in an environment. Once you've done this, then you're in a situation where this might perpetuate itself and start becoming a canonical representation of the form, even if that person might tell you, I just made the best guess I could make in the time frame that I had and with the resources that I had, and 10 years later, I'm sure I would do something else. Basic level of support for authoring. Stuff like that. This is one of these breeding books from the ORIA communities I mentioned earlier. This might be enough to get some stuff out at schools and so on. It clearly is not typographically refined. If I start typesetting more than something like that, then the language, the voice of the teacher and the voice of the student looks the same. The voice of the narration of the exercise that says, write me an essay about this, sounds the same as the voice of the person who actually types it. So I'm really lacking quite a lot of stuff to do. These things might appear to be a little bit more refined in terms of the typographic connection to other scripts. In this case, an extension of the Latin script that will support the notation of languages from Brazilian indigenous communities. So this is very refined typographically. It might, again, be limited to the variations that its association with the Latin script allows. So again, the existence of other standards will inform the decisions we make for something new. This is where things get a little bit more interesting. In order to do anything, you have to do this. So how do you convey authority? How do you convey different instructions, sort of query response systems and so on? And you essentially need at least a couple of different tones of voice. Headings and subheadings, so things that might have 2 tones of voice at least, and then you might use size, color, space, and so on to add some nuance in this. You can get away with a couple of things only online because you have color. If you're doing things in typography, then you might also need some other differentiation that has to do with maybe an alternate style and so on, or more inventive use of space. What is also interesting in this case, and this is quite particular because this is the government speaking to you, there's no italics in this case. So the government does not speak in emphasis tones. They don't say, make sure you bring your passport, because they don't trust you to be able to understand this. They want to speak in a very monotone, clear voice. The rules for composing these texts are, again, avoiding any ambiguities. So you can see that once you tell people what they need to do in a list element, then you want to speak in a very clear voice. There's no italics in the typeface at all. The whole of the communication of the British government to these people has 0 italics, which actually an interesting editorial challenge, because then you think, well, when do I begin to need italics for emphasis, differentiation, different kinds of notation, or higher levels? What is also interesting, again, is what are the assembly systems around this? Most of all the stuff that we're using now is determined by the assembly systems that happen on an online first environment. And what is really good to see is, again, look at CSS and what does CSS tell you about your typographic resources, but also look at the assembly systems. Most of the stuff that we do now is object-based in a different way than InDesign thinks about objects. And it has to do with modules that get repeated and are essentially little chunks of specification that automatically suck content from somewhere. And you can see this in pretty much anything that you spend, I don't know, at least half of your day on. If you're anything like me, probably more than half of your day on things like this. And what I see here is essentially the representations of CSS values that will be connected to a typeface. So then I can see how the specification for a typeface system comes out of these assembly systems. What is, I think, it's the immediately direct level. Some people might think this is not the immediate direct level, but has to do with accessibility and enabling new uses. So if I've got something that has to do with different sizes, how do I modify things to operate in different optical sizes? This for me is quite interesting because until, say, phototypesetting and early digital destroyed the idea of designing typefaces for specific optical sizes, this was something assumed. And my view is that we went through this period of maybe 20, 25 years of destroying this idea of designing for optical sizes and imitating this with other rules, and now we're beginning to find back that actually optical size specific design is one of the fundamental elements in enabling people access. Also, the change of the demographic is quite important in this. As people get older, the eye conditions become more important, different reading devices and environments come into play. Designing for optical sizes will matter. Designing for variant backgrounds. I can see you doing that there. You're going, oh, this doesn't look nice. But this will happen more and more, where the assumption that there is a uniform background to type will slowly dissolve, because we will be projecting things in front of us. If you've got a brand new German car right now, probably does this on your windscreen. If you have goggles for specialist applications, they might do this. And in 5 years' time, sort of crappy glasses like these will definitely project something in there because it'll be cheap enough to do it. The problem is then that those bits of letters that give me the directions to come from the hotel here will be projected on top of something else that will, as I move my head, will be constantly variant in terms of contrast, in terms of background differentiation, and so on. We're just beginning to learn what this means. What happens when I have parallax changes and the type needs to indicate perspective and so on. Things that happen in a more virtual, the next layer of virtual environments, where LEDs are projected constantly on top of games. It's just around the corner, the time when we will realize that actually playing games on a screen is just so boring and mundane, because I could be playing games in my living room. And we'll get over the point of how do I adjust the headset so I don't get dizzy or whatever. But clearly it's way more interesting to play, I don't know, Star Wars Kill Everyone, whatever the game is called, with an immersive environment rather than something that is just on a small screen. That needs type, that needs direction elements, that needs another layer of development in these things. And of course, accessibility is the much more mundane environment of making sure that what works on a large screen also works on a small screen. And this is where the market really now begins to come in and has to do with genre and specific conventions. What is something that will only work in a specific environment with a very specific community that requires that signification that says this is children friendly. Actually, this tells the parents that this is children friendly, but anyway. Or things that have to do with all the stuff that are beginning to become part of our visual language. So if you would think, oh, how does the question, what is the character set, change over time? The character set that I'm familiar with in the languages that I use will definitely include symbolic representations of things like, or icons or connections to things, interactive elements. Why are these not part of my visual language? Of course they are. Then what is the degree to which I design them to conform to the rest of the typographic arrangement I'm using? And then, of course, I have a fairly mature environment typographically that might need to distinguish between things like editorial publications without the recourse of something that is hard copy, that has materiality, that has the interaction of a printed object in it, and it only has a certain typographic environment for me to distinguish it. That is actually something that's quite important. What tells you something about identity, about style, about aspiration in a typographic-only environment. And again, the assembly systems for this are quite important because they themselves precipitate certain changes. So something as mundane and boring as InDesign might mean that I can have italic Chinese. Now, if I had asked you, does Chinese have italic just before I showed you the slide, you would say no, and yes, it does, because I can click italic and I can get italic Chinese. Now, once I can do that, I can now use that italicization to indicate that this is an idiom, it's an expression, therefore it has a semantic difference, and it enriches my language in a way. My perpetual joke with people from India is, does Devanagari have italic? They'll say no. Look at any Air India airplane, and it has go fast Devanagari on the side, because it wants to indicate this sense of speed with the airplane. So that kind of stuff happens. And if you think I'm going too far, look at this. Now, at which point do emojis become a set of symbols that are part of our normal visual language? They are designed to be appropriate with an environment. So why do I get this crappy generic emoji with a system that might be a branded environment? Why does each brand not have its own set of emojis? What is the degree of differentiation for a typographic environment I expect of emojis? And this is going to hit, specifically, is going to hit the market fairly quickly, because people my age, I don't send emojis to Fiona or our head of department, but all the people who are maybe up to 30 right now, they've grown up sending emojis to each other all the time. So they're migrating into the world environment feeling pretty comfortable about exchanging emojis in serious environments as well. So if you look at how Slack has been pushing its corporate communications, it's full of emojis. If you look at newsletters that are coming from things like Quartz and so on, there's emojis everywhere, because they're trying to recognize that the younger generation of consumers are much more familiar with this, and there's an opportunity to bring this refinement of visual language into corporate communication. And it won't be long before someone says, well, why do ours look like this? And what do I do when I have a selection of something? And does it slant? Does it do something? Does the expression change? Is there an extra emphasis or rhino? Does the smile get deeper if I italicize it? Maybe that's a decision you need to think about. And the development of variable fonts, I think, will accelerate this. Because once we have a generation of tools that make it easier for people to take advantage of the potential of variable fonts, it will be easier to introduce this kind of what-if scenarios in visual communication. So going back to these things, typeface design, it's a really good lens through which to see quite a lot of different issues, especially the social values, the issues of modernity and tradition, personal values, originality, innovation, authority and agency, sort of authorship, who owns things, who benefits from things, who controls the risk for anything, who extracts value, and what is the language that we use, what's the terminology, how do we communicate things, and what limitations does this place want we work. And this gives us a framework for thinking about type and typography, and through this, actually see communities and human activity in a much more rich manner. Thank you, I'm done. Do I do this?